the betrayal of Donald Trump to any individual or any cause is never a surprise. That's a through line for the man's entire life. The important thing that is worth coming back to again and again is it's the people and his followers and their betrayal, because they actually know better.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charen, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Damon Linker, who writes the Substack newsletter Notes from the Middle Ground, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Our special guest this week is The Atlantic's Peter Wehner, whose latest piece out this week is titled Trump's Evangelical Supporters Just Lost Their Best Excuse. And we will come to that in our second segment. But first, welcome one and all. I am delighted to be back in the captain's chair here and want to thank Andrew Egger for a great job subbing last week. Thank him very much. And also A.B. Stoddard for filling in at the last minute. So I'd like to begin this week with something that I have to say was really, really notable. The change in tone in the Democratic Party based on what we saw at that convention. When Kamala Harris picked Tim Walz, a lot of people thought, well, this is maybe her signal that she's sort of caving to the left or, you know. On the other hand, we on this podcast speculated that perhaps having done that, she could then pivot to the center without fear of alienating her progressive base. And seems like that is kind of what happened. Pete, you and I both served in Republican presidential administrations, were Republicans for many, many decades. I'm just wondering if you were struck by the unbelievably patriotic and even sort of robust defense tone that the Democrats struck last week in Chicago.
Yeah, I was. Thanks for having me on, by the way. It was notable. It was not a progressive party. There's no question that Kamala Harris and Walz and the team that they have around them want to move to the center. They're doing it. She's jettisoned her most radical views on fracking and on the border and on other things. But as you said, Mona, there was a thematic change. I mean, they basically wrapped themselves in the flag. There were, football players, and football was stressed. Veterans were stressed, even to some extent law enforcement. And that sometimes matters as much as policy, sometimes more than policy. So there's no question in my mind that the Democrats have learned lessons. They're attacking to the center. I think that that's good news for them. And the fact that a lot of Republicans are so irritated at that probably underscores that they're making a wise move.
Right. Just to give a flavor, and I'm going to come to you, Bill Galston, among the things that the nominee said, and there were lots of other patriotic messages that were delivered by other speakers during the course of the convention, but she talked about the service of veterans and said, I will always honor and never disparage their service and sacrifice. She said she would hold sacred America's fundamental principles, from the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power. But my favorite, because I know it must have, well, not for that reason. Let me start again. My favorite was her saying that she pledged to maintain, as commander-in-chief, she would maintain the American military as the most lethal fighting force on earth. And, as a conservative, I listen to that and I think, excellent, that is great, because too often, I would say in the past, the Democrats have tended to come across as believing that the military was basically a humanitarian or maybe a social justice organization that had to, occasionally buy planes and missiles. But she seemed very unconfused that a military is really intended to be lethal. What do you make of this?
Well, the music was fantastic. As a music critic, I'd give it an A+. And if you sense a but lurking in the background, it's a but that has more to do with governance, post-January, if she's elected, than it does with the election strategy, which I think is impressively focused in exactly the right areas. I haven't seen a lot of discussion yet. I know this is hopelessly out of fashion, to think about the prose behind the poetry. And no doubt some listeners will believe that I'm yet again raising my tail and performing my traditional role of skunk at the garden party. But what does this mean for the defense budget? What does it mean for the use of force in times of emergency? Is there an organized way of thinking about the hard choices that need to be made? If she had a long independent track record in these areas, I wouldn't have to pose that question. But she doesn't, and so I do. And that is why I, for one, think that she and the country would be well served by a little bit of prose in advance of the election rather than after it about the actual concrete policies that will undergird these entirely correct and admirable commitments. And I am hoping that the kind of Democratic Party that I've fought for all of my adult life, and which was very much in evidence last week, will turn out to be the future, the concrete future of the Democratic Party. If it does, I will retire. My work, such as it is, my modest contribution to the recentering of the Democratic Party will be over. So to sum up, I have zero complaints about what I saw and heard at the convention. It was exceedingly not only well judged, but well executed. And I have my own views, which we can save for another round, as to where the race now stands. But there's no question about the fact that compared to 6 weeks ago, it's night and day, and Harris and her team have a lot to do with that.
All right. So, Linda, you could make the case that campaigns frequently fail to illuminate future presidencies. People say a lot of things to get elected and then frequently do nothing about them, or sometimes the exact opposite. You remember George H.W. Bush saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Then he raised taxes. You can go back further than that to FDR's first run. In 1932, he talked about, balancing budgets and fiscal responsibility and, restraint, all these things. And then he proceeded to do the huge, expansion of the federal role. So how do you evaluate? Do you think Bill's right that, that first of all, that we need some meat on these bones? Do you think that's going to be forthcoming in the interview that Vice President Harris and her VP nominee Walz are going to be doing this week with CNN, and also your impressions coming out of the convention?
All right. Well, that was a big assignment.
A multi-part question.
Let me start with reacting to what Bill had to say. Okay. Bill is one of the Democrats I have admired most going back to the 1980s. I mean, he's been around a long time, the Democratic Leadership Council. He was involved in that. He did a great job. Bill Clinton was a more centrist candidate, I think, because of work by Bill and others. However, when it comes to getting into the nitty-gritty on policy details, please, Kamala, don't listen to what Bill has to say. The last thing in the world we need is the sort of step-by-step, because it will be torn apart and it will give huge targets. I think what she did was very Reagan-esque. I actually went back after watching her speech to watch Ronald Reagan's acceptance speech in 1980. And there were remarkable similarities in the tone and style. And I think, she is just, like it or not, she is just introducing herself to most of the American public. Maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe there ought to be a candidate at the top of the ticket that people know more about, but they don't. And so I think what she did was brilliant in the sense that it put together a tonal framework and a values-laden framework. I mean, the Republican Party used to be the party of values. Well, if you listen to the Democratic convention last week, they are now the party of values. And the values she put forth with patriotism in the highlight was wonderful. And I have to say, it sounded really like it came from her gut. It did not look like she was reading lines on a teleprompter. She sounded so sincere in talking about this is the greatest nation in the history of the world, and her love for it and what she's been able to accomplish could only happen here. So I love that, and I hope she keeps that up. Yes, she does have to be a little more specific. But, again, going back, and I feel like a broken record, always going back to Reagan, but that's the president I worked for. And he laid broad frameworks, but, he didn't lay out specifics on each and every economic policy. And by the way, in terms of defense, I absolutely agree with you, Mona, that I was very heartened to say that she wants the U.S. to be the most lethal force in the world. But she doesn't have to lay out specifics of what weapons systems she wants to introduce or how much money she wants to spend on it, although it will mean more money, and that will mean reprioritizing. But anyway, I thought it was a great job. Yes, I look forward to hearing more, and she's got to give a sense that she is in command of details when she does the interview later this week. But I don't want too much specificity because I think it will become a distraction and will give a huge bullseye to the Trump campaign to go after.
Damon, this was an unusual year in so many respects, but so in particular about both conventions. Both conventions featured this just overwhelming certainty, joy that they were the winners, right? Because recall, the Republican convention happened just a few days after the attempted assassination of Trump, and you had all of this hero worship, people wearing the little bandages on their ears and, practically kowtowing to the great leader. And saying things to the press like, I just can't believe how well everything's going. We're destined to win. God wanted Trump to be spared, and so we can't lose. And then the Democrats, having pushed Biden aside, and then this eruption of enthusiasm for an alternative and for Kamala, and the fact that it hasn't stopped. I mean, if you look at the voter registration numbers among Democrats, they're kind of through the roof since she took over. And so there is this tremendous enthusiasm on both sides, I would say. But and yet there hasn't been the kind of surge in the polls that we were used to in previous times. Maybe we'll see it, but it hasn't happened yet. So are we laying too much emphasis on the mood of the convention and attempting to transfer that to the public at large? I mean, very few people in the United States actually watched her her acceptance speech. However much the people on this panel may have thought she did a great job, still the case that a lot of voters won't have seen it.
Yes, that's true. Although I think probably a lot of voters will have seen clips from it. That's probably how this kind of messaging gets out these days, more than people sitting down at 10:30 at night in front of the television or watching it live. I just want to briefly begin by saying I'm with everybody else on the podcast of thinking that she did a fabulous job. The patriotism on display at the convention throughout the whole 4 days was great. And then it just kind of built as a crescendo from around 8:30 or 9 o'clock last Thursday on, with Leon Panetta's remarks, Adam Kinzinger's remarks about Trump that were very hard-hitting and smart. And just in general, as everyone
previous
said,
guest on this podcast and will be again,
yes,
Adam Kinzinger.
Yes, deep ties to the Bulwark. And then especially on foreign and domestic defense policy, that was very, very important to hear from a Democrat, and really I think it points to the way in which we can debate about how significant it is in the makeup of the two parties that there are these Republicans, like those who work at the Bulwark, former Republicans who have shifted over to the center left in a lot of ways to oppose Trump and therefore become supporters of Joe Biden and now probably Kamala Harris. But when you hear her remarks, you realize that this has been a kind of shifting of the weight of gravity between the two parties over which one will be the spokespeople for a robust American defense. From the Republicans to now the Democrats, it's a kind of parallel to what we see with like Bill Kristol being, the great neocon, Republican advisor, conservative for decades, and then switches over. And it isn't just him. It's kind of the Nikki Haley voter phenomenon. Even if Nikki Haley herself has, gone crawling back to Trump, a lot of the people who supported her are not doing that. And I think would love to hear a Democratic Party who can espouse the kind of views that she holds. And I think that we see a real play for that from Kamala Harris, and that's a very good thing for the country. Now, for the rest of what you said about the enthusiasm, I mean, of course, a political convention is like a pep rally for one party or the other. So the Republicans were really whipped up and excited. And then the Democrats were really whipped up and excited. And it is true that, so far, at least, we haven't seen a big bounce coming out of this convention for Kamala Harris. But we really need to keep in mind that the Democrats already have undergone a massive bounce since she took over from Joe Biden. We went from month upon month of Trump tied or slightly ahead in head-to-head polls and ahead in all or most of the swing states to now a new reality that I think it's been going on long enough now that we can call it the new reality, where Kamala Harris is somewhat ahead consistently, 2, 3, 4 points ahead nationally, and then either tied or slightly ahead in the swing states, such that as of today, the Cook Political Report moved North Carolina into the lean Democrat slot, which is just massive, because 6-8 weeks ago, we were in a kind of inverse reality where Trump's Republicans appeared to be putting Minnesota in play, putting Virginia in play. And now that is completely off the table. And instead, we're starting to see places that seem pretty comfortably in the Republican column now either competitive or slightly leaning toward the Democrats. Now, as maybe Bill will say in a later segment of today's show, It is true that, the margin's pretty close. It's within the margin of error in a lot of places. So it's still a very close race and probably will continue to be one. There probably will be some tightening up. But we really should take at least a moment, if for nothing else than the sake of our listeners who get irritated at us when we become that skunk at the garden party, as Bill mentioned, to just say, like, this is a remarkable turn of events. And if you want to know why, a good part of it is the very good things that we were hearing at that convention. And they will get out. They might not get out from people watching the show that very night, but they're all part of a campaign and its message and the kind of vision of the Democratic Party that it is trying to convey. And as long as it's consistent with that, it should make a real and important difference.
Pete, I want to come back to you for a final thought about this. And I want to direct your thoughts to Kamala Harris herself and her performance, because none of this happens without the dramatically better performance that we have seen from her. All of us were nervous about her as a potential nominee. We were aware of her slip-ups during the vice presidency, the early interviews that didn't go so well, her really, frankly, faceplant in 2019 as a candidate, where she didn't seem to really know why she was running. She said a lot of things that she clearly didn't really have her heart in, and didn't make it even to the first contest. She dropped out before a vote was cast. Okay. And yet what we see now is somebody who has really come into their own, really grown. I was struck by it that very first day when she spoke at the campaign headquarters in Delaware. There is a poise and a comfort about the woman now. She is both charming and has that 10,000 megawatt smile, but which, by the way, has served other candidates very well: Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, many others. But in addition to that, she has a certain command. She looks like and acts like a commander, like you can see her in the role of commander in chief. So I want to hear your views on that, because I do think if she had come out stumbly and unsure and sounded more like the Kamala Harris of 2020 or 2021 even, we wouldn't be where we are. She has really grown, right?
Yeah, absolutely. My views align exactly with yours. I mean, she's essentially been the nominee for 5 weeks, and I don't think she's made a single misstep, large or small. That is remarkable. And, Bill's worked on presidential campaigns. I have. They're hard. If you're a governor or a senator and you think you know what it's like to run for president, you actually don't. It's a lot more challenging than that. And to have gone that length of time without any mistakes, especially given her history, which she did a nice job documenting, really has been remarkable to see. And I agree with you as well. I mean, the entire landscape, the entire lighting of this campaign has shifted. She's changed the emotional valence of it. She's captured kind of joy after the darkness of the Obama, the joy after the Trump years. And even Joe Biden in opposing Trump was sort of meeting anger for anger. So she shifted that. Last thing I want to say, Mona, on this is if you go back to Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020, both of them were in a better position in the polls than Kamala Harris is right now. Here is the difference, I think, which is she is a better candidate than either of them. And Donald Trump is worse than he was then. So
that's such a good point.
I do think that the snapshot matters. The trajectory also matters. And she is just a lot better candidate than he is. And she's going into the traditional Labor Day to the election stretch with a better campaign. She's a better candidate, and she's ahead slightly. So that all, I think, is good for her and their prospects.
Okay, thank you. We will turn to another topic in a second, but first we're going to have a word from Factor. Warmer, sunnier days are calling. Fuel up for them with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals in time for summer thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. What are you waiting for? They have 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week. You'll always have new flavors to explore. You can crush your wellness goals this month with dietitian-approved meals and ingredients that you can trust. From breakfast to dessert, stay fueled with easy, nutritious options. And you also keep your kitchen time to a minimum. Factor meals are ready in 2 minutes with no shopping, prepping, cooking, or cleaning up. Enjoy effortless support for your lifestyle. Choose from 6 menu preferences. You can either manage calories, maximize protein intake, avoid meat, or simply get a well-balanced diet. Head to factormeals.com/begtodiffer50 and use code begtodiffer50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code begtodiffer50 at factormeals.com/begtodiffer50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. And we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. All right, let us now discuss Donald Trump and his week, which has not been great. Included an altercation at the Arlington National Cemetery, where only the Trump people could attempt to do something like honoring dead soldiers and turn it into a fight. So yeah, they managed that. But let's talk, Pete, you had a really good piece in The Atlantic this week, talking about what is the latest, but not unpredicted, Trump betrayal. You're talking about the evangelicals who have basically thrown aside every value that they ever claimed to cherish in the name of the pro-life cause, basically. And they've said, well, he is reliable on that, so it's worth tossing aside everything else. And now what's going on?
Yeah, well, now the pro-life movement's thrown aside their commitment to the pro-life cause, which is not a shock. But if you had said to any of us 15, 20 years ago that the pro-life movement would vote for a pro-choice felon on the ticket, we probably would have said probably not. But thus is where we are. I'd say a couple of things about that. The betrayal of Donald Trump to any individual or any cause is never a surprise. That's a through line for the man's entire life. The important thing that is worth coming back to again and again is it's the people and his followers and their betrayal, because they actually know better. And Trump did this step by step. Abortion became a campaign problem for him, so sort of a millstone around his neck. So they got rid of the pro-life platform. That was first. Second, he was
the Republican Party revised its platform.
Exactly. And as you know, since 1980, it's been pro-life. And if there was even a peep that the platform would change, there would be outrage from the pro-life movement. Now it's been jettisoned, virtually nothing said. He's critical of pro-life initiatives in Florida and elsewhere. And now he's using the language pro-life. He's now using pro-choice language. So it is a remarkable thing to see, and it really illustrates what has been one of the most important things about the Trump era, which is his effect on other people, on the movement, on the base. It's deeply cynical, and it just goes to show that so much of what they said they believed in, or they thought they believed in, was an affectation. It was an illusion. And it turns out at the end of the day that what really draws them and their loyalties and their loves is Donald Trump's disposition, his temperament, the cruelty, the crudity, the unceasing attacks, and the dishonesty and the lawlessness. That, at the end of the day, is what vivifies them. It gives them a kind of life. And it's a really discouraging picture, but I think it's true, and I think we have to name it.
Damon, the MAGA people are fond of labeling anybody who criticizes Trump as a rhino, and that's their only measure. Is if you're critical of Trump, they say, well, you're not a true conservative, but they are willing to, if anybody else had said we should drop the pro-life platform from the Republican convention, they would have denounced them in the most fierce terms. But Trump did it, and they are like little poodles. There are one or two voices that are critical, but basically, it's a cult.
It is, but this is an interesting topic because if you told me that the Republican Party, forget about Trump for a second, if you told me like 8-10 years ago, and in 2024, the Republican Party would abandon its call since 1984 for a constitutional amendment banning abortion in place of like watery language about federalism that letting states decide, I would have said, wow, the party is really liberalized. That's actually probably good. And that would include with the, overturning of Roe, because that throws it back to the states. And then fine, let's have laboratories of democracy and let Utah pretty much ban abortion and states in the South if they want to. But then the Northeast and the West Coast, they can have far more extreme pro-choice laws than Europe. And then maybe we'll eventually reform them in various directions as the argument continues. I would have thought that was great. But we're in this weird situation where the person doing it is Donald Trump. And so my view of Trump all along from the very beginning is that he's this kind of like right-wing populist extremist who's extremely dangerous and should not be in power or close to power or have an influence over voters in the way he does. That's a bad thing. But there's a weird way in which from the beginning he has represented a kind of moderation of certain ideological commitments of the Republican Party, which have now extended also to abortion. I live in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. I've been a registered Democrat here for 18 years. And almost every day now, I receive an 11-by-6 cardboard card in the mail, direct mail from the Trump campaign. Sometimes I get 2 or 3 of them in a day. This much be costing a fortune for like eyeball for dollar. The amount that costs compared to like a television ad or a radio ad is astronomical. So this is not necessarily a great campaign strategy, but especially because I'm a registered Democrat and I'm getting it. This is one side of this color card is all about how terrible Kamala Harris is, all the positions. Basically, it's what she was running on in 2019 as if she's running on it now. And then you turn it over and it says, Donald Trump, common sense. And it's like, he won't tax your Social Security income. He won't tax your tips. And good federalism on abortion. Let the states decide abortion. And again, I say, if I had received this with some generic Republican attached to it 10 years ago and said, this is what the Republican Party stood for, I'd be like, wow, the Republican Party has totally moderated. They're like a total hugging the center line in every way. But of course, Donald Trump remains pretty much insane. And when it comes to his tactics, whether it has to do with elections, whether it has to do with whether he'll accept elections, how he deals with his opponents, whether he'll pick a fight with and attack, people who work at Arlington Cemetery when they come to try to violate the law, and so forth, as you mentioned earlier, Mona, it hasn't moderated at all. And this is where we are, this weird position where We have a Republican Party that has a lunatic in charge of it who would much rather dispense with any ideological or principled commitment to what used to be called conservatism in favor of this kind of fluid, non-principled willingness to say anything to win. And until you've absorbed like those two things and that somehow we're in both at the same time, you won't understand the reality of where we are.
So, Linda, it's everything that Pete said about Trump will betray everybody. That's pretty much, you could take that to the bank. That's all true. But it is also the case, isn't it, that by the way, I'm sure, Damon, that the people who are arranging those cards that are coming to your door, and you are the most important voter in the world, being a Pennsylvanian, is Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles. I'm sure Trump had nothing whatsoever to do with that.
Of course,
but
it's the campaign.
Yeah, it's the campaign. But Linda, Trump said, well, he says a lot of idiotic things. Everybody wanted Roe v. Wade overturned, which is, not, it's preposterous. But then
3/4 of the country did not.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
But he says, but it does show that in his world, I mean, he is living within a bubble where, most conservatives did want it to be overturned. But anyway, he thought he had hit upon this great dodge, which is, well, it's, as Damon was saying, it's federalism. Let the states decide, and that will be that. And that might have worked as a political matter, except that the pro-life movement and many Republicans were not willing and weren't content to let it sit there. They are moving for a national abortion ban. They are talking about restricting abortion pills from being mailed across state lines and prohibiting women from traveling from one state to another. And so it's not just that that he has gone back on his word. It's that the technique he settled upon is being undermined by his own side, this whole federalism argument.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And, when I ran for the Senate in 1986, I actually favored the federal approach and thought that states should decide it. And I still believe that if there had not been a Roe v. Wade, if states had been doing what they were doing in 1972-73, which was basically liberalizing strict abortion laws, making it easier for women to get abortions, but not necessarily saying you didn't have to have some reason, that you had to come up with some rationale, that it shouldn't be just entirely a matter of choice. That if that had happened, we'd be in a very different place in this country politically, but it didn't. So when Roe was overturned, I think there was still some people who thought, okay, well, now we'll get back to where we were in 1973. We'll work it all out. But the problem was the pro-life movement in some ways has become much more radical. And I think, so you have now states that are not willing to even have exceptions for rape and incest. You have no abortions before, or rather after 6 weeks. All of these things, I think, were not what was expected. So he has been handed that. But have no illusion about what this is all about. The Republican Party does stand for something now. It stands for whatever Donald Trump wants, whatever it's going to take for Donald Trump to win an election. That is what the Republican Party stands for. And as for all the mailers you're getting, Damon, let's remember that all those mailers cost money. There are a lot of grifters in the Republican Party. Every time you get a mailer, it's costing them a fortune. And they're raising that money mostly from small donors. And it's clearly not an effective way to reach voters in this age. And it's certainly the most expensive way. So I think you have to remember profits, grifting, and Donald Trump and his ego are behind everything. And we will never pin him down. I mean, he's been asked the very simple question. Okay, it's a state matter. You're a registered voter in Florida. It's on the ballot there. Are you going to vote for the 6-week ban? He won't answer.
Bill Galston, sometimes people fetishize having their candidate mouth the words they want to hear without taking account of the fact that the world's a complicated place, and merely voting for a candidate who says they're pro-life, or even a candidate who overturns Dobbs, doesn't mean you're going to achieve the outcome that you desire. I mean, the number of abortions actually rose under Trump after a 30-year steady decline. After the Dobbs decision, the actual number of abortions again rose. And so if what you're after is to have fewer unborn babies die, it's worth considering that this legal technique of just voting, the political technique of simply voting for somebody who says, well, I will outlaw it, may not be the best way, and certainly not the only way to achieve your goals.
Well, compared to Pete and others on this program, I am really an outsider to this discussion. That said, let me try to frame my reaction to it. I've believed for a long time, and have said repeatedly, that Donald Trump has a small core of matters, about which he has settled views that have been unchanged for 3 or 4 decades. We all know what they are. He's against immigration, he's against free trade, and he's against the kind of global commitments that now travel under the head of liberal internationalism. Everything else is transactional and negotiable. Everything. To give him credit for political sense, he saw immediately after the Dobbs decision that a winning issue had turned into a losing issue. And, it didn't take him more than a month to begin backing away from any national post-Dobbs approach on this issue. I am utterly unsurprised that he has adopted the federalism approach. He signaled that. His vice presidential candidate has gone so far as to say that if a national abortion ban reached his desk, he would veto it. I think that's probably true. And so Trump is looking at this issue from a purely power politics point of view. He asked himself a very simple question. What stance will give me the best chance of either gaining ground on this issue or not losing ground and the election because of this issue? I think arguably he arrived at the correct conclusion. And so, Mona, if I may call an audible here, I'd like to ask Pete a question. And I have, this is not a prosecuting attorney's trick. I have absolutely no idea what you're going to say. But in your judgment, will there be a wholesale withdrawal of evangelical support from Donald Trump? Will their turnout be down? And will some of them at least vote against him, perhaps cast protest votes? In other words, what's the net effect of this? Because I can tell you on the other side of the ballot sheet, he at least has a crack at moderate suburban voters in Pennsylvania who care a lot about this issue and who were quite surprised and horrified when Roe was overturned.
Yeah, it's a good question, Bill. I'd say that there is going to be almost no effect on the white evangelical vote for him. He's going to register what he did in 2020, maybe even bump it up a little bit because of the nature of the cult-like allegiance to him. It could have politically a slightly negative effect. I'd say in two things conjoined. One is it can dispirit the pro-life movement, which is dispirited in any event because the country has turned against their views so strongly in the wake of the Dobbs decision. The second thing is that I just don't think this is going to work with Trump. I mean, he is the author, essentially, he has claimed to be the author of overturning Roe v. Wade, which is the piston in the engine of the pro-choice movement right now. And I can't imagine anybody who's on the fence that thinks that Donald Trump is going to be a better champion if you're pro-choice than Kamala Harris. So I don't think he's going to get any credit for the people he's trying to appeal to, and it could be slightly dispiriting to his base. But look, I agree with you, Bill. I think that the position where he was, which was federalism, let the states decide, I think that was good. I think in the last week he went further than that in basically adapting a pro-choice position. I don't think that will help him. But again, the last thing I would say is that what this incident tells us is nothing new about Donald Trump. It's what it underscores about his supporters that we need to pay attention to.
It is amazing that he tweeted or posted on Truth Social, quote, "My administration will be great for women and their reproductive rights," unquote, which is the kind of thing, again, that would have driven most of his most ardent supporters around the bend had it been said by anybody else. Anybody.
Could I just offer a thought here? Because I want to pick up on something Peter said, and that is, I think there is a segment of the Catholic vote that may be affected by that. There are Catholics for whom the pro-life position is their one and only position. And they were willing to turn the other way on Trump and some of his cruelty, his immigration policy. The Catholic Church is growing in the United States because of immigrants. It tends to be very, very pro-immigrant in its policy. So I don't know what percentage it's going to be, but I can see some Catholics saying, wow, now I can't vote for him. It was the only reason I supported him. Now I'm not sure I can. Maybe it will be a few thousand. Maybe it'll be more than that.
Well, go ahead, Bill. Did you want to say something else?
I was just going to say that for what the polls are worth, they don't show a lot of daylight between Catholic sentiment on this issue and national sentiment on this issue. And so I think what we're really talking about is whether a meaningful fraction of the support that Trump would have gotten will just stay home. And
right.
And I have no feel for that segment of the electorate. I don't know. I find it interesting that that Pete wasn't confident in the view that there would be a large effect. As a matter of fact, if I heard him correctly, he articulated the opposite view. So this may not be a miscalculation on Trump's part, but we won't know until it all comes out on November 5th.
Well, and at this remove, before Labor Day in an election year, it is really hard to say whether this is going to be a squeaker of an election or not. We don't know that. But if it is a squeaker, then every little change in voter sentiment is potentially important. And so we will see. But speaking of small changes, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Endorsed Donald Trump this past week. And now Trump has also named RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard to be co-chairman of his transition team and to be deciding matters like who the second, God forbid, Trump administration should hire. And it's worth pausing just for a moment over this because, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is such a freak. He is clearly, in my opinion, not offering a medical diagnosis, but there's something wrong with the guy. There's something not right in the head. Normal people don't take dead bears in their car trunk and then dump them in Central Park and make it look like a biking accident and think that's funny. They don't use power saws to behead whales and put them on the top of their cars and drive 5 hours. far less all of the crazy things that he believes about politics. I mean, he thinks we are under constant surveillance. He believes the CIA, not Sirhan, killed his father. He has been a proponent of the worst kinds of conspiracies about vaccines, and so I just want to start there. Damon, so many articles this week have thought that they had a really great hook. I saw this on New York Times and I saw it on National Review that, RFK claims to be for health and he's all about, don't we want healthy children? But Donald Trump cut funding for various health programs. Ha ha. So, owned. But the reality is that RFK has been one of the most pernicious underminers of American health by his spreading false stories about the effects of vaccines. And so your thoughts?
Thoughts? Who has those about this? You all remember the old Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer cartoon, claymation thing from the 60s. There's a little segment there about the island of misfit toys. This is the island of political misfit toys, this bunch who's gathering around Trump. This goes back to what I was saying in the last segment about abortion and Trump's move to the center on that. This weird combination, on the one hand, he seems like he's trying to be as moderate and mainstream as possible. And on the other hand, he and everyone around him it's like, let's find everyone out there in the country who is convinced of every conspiracy, of every bit of radical skepticism about our institutions, about the motives of those who run them, about the competence of experts in all fields, including medicine and science and the environment, and gather all of them together, and they'll all vote for Donald Trump. And that's what the Republican Party under Trump is becoming. It's a magnet for anyone who just wants to say, I hate that stuff, all of that. Everyone in charge, everyone, the FBI, the intelligence community, the soldiers who fight our wars and the generals who are in charge of them, and the health bureaucracy, public health, and the environmental movement, and all of them. And then you throw in Tulsi Gabbard as well, who tried to do this as a Democrat, and to the credit of the Democratic Party, at least up till now, had no luck whatsoever, because there's really very little audience for her. And it's significant that when RFK, whose family is one of the most storied Democratic families in the last 100 years of American history, when RFK drops out, he doesn't really seriously entertain endorsing Kamala Harris. I mean, I think he put out feelers to see if they would give him a job, and Kamala Harris apparently said, no, I'm not even going to take a meeting with that freak. And so he goes to Trump, and Trump will take the meeting. Sure, why not? You'll support me. I'll get a couple hundred extra votes in a few places. Sure, I'll take your support. And yeah, if you want to say the ultimate say in who runs the Department of Health and Human Services in a second Trump administration, by all means. Oh, you're going to suggest yourself to be the head of that? Oh, okay, sure, whatever, that's fine. So this is this weird thing. Once again, I just go back to this bizarre combination of principleless tacking toward the center of public opinion on various things with procedurally and tactically total insanity. It's this completely bizarre blend. The Trumpian center, that's what it is. It's like everyone who belongs on the island of political misfit toys banded together in a movement. That's all I can think to say on this lovely topic.
Pete, and then there's Tulsi Gabbard, already mentioned, but chief apologist for dictators. She was cozy with Assad in Syria, war criminal. She is vehemently anti-Ukraine. So that there's that. And then, we just throw in, we could sit here all day ticking off the crazy things that RFK Jr. has said. And so I won't do that. But here's one of the highlights is that he was quoted as saying at a dinner party that COVID-19, the virus, was genetically engineered to attack Caucasians and Black people and to leave immune Ashkenazi Jews and the Chinese. Yeah, totally sane, right?
Yeah, I endorse completely what you said. It could be actually a brilliant campaign move by Trump, which is he wanted to get attention away from his very weird vice presidential choice. So he decided to turn attention to his freakish Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard combination. There is no end. It could be that next week Marjorie Taylor Greene will attempt to take attention away from Robert Kennedy Jr. We don't know where this is going to end. But Damon's right. I mean, it's in a way funny. Of course, he presented it in a witty and funny way. But there's something deeply disturbing about it, which is it's a kind of magnet for not just resentments, but this kind of freakishness that you were alluding to. And there's no sign that it's getting better. In fact, there are signs that it's getting more acute.
Yep. Linda, any thoughts about mass shootings being caused by Prozac or any of the other things that RFK Jr. has introduced? Oh yeah, the vaccines. The meme that went around the internet that Bill Gates was using these vaccines to inject people with microchips. RFK Jr. He originated that.
It's very sad. In many ways. And I mean, we sort of sit here and laugh about him. And I love Damon's reference to the island of misfit toys. But we talk about how Donald Trump is crazy, and he is. But there's something deeply wrong with RFK Jr. I mean, I don't know if it was the worm that died in his brain. I don't know if it was the tragedy, of his family that he lived with. But this is not a normal man. And, it is sort of sad having grown up, with the family of the Kennedys as being this sort of, it was equivalent to our aristocracy, Camelot at all. So in that sense, I'm glad he's gone. I don't think it's going to have any impact. And Bill offline shared an analysis that suggests this is not going to be, a 2-point boom to Trump. But there is something deeply sad about it.
Bill?
I'm afraid Mighty Casey is going to strike out on this one, Mona. I can't think of anything to say that hasn't already been said. And better.
That's totally fine because we're actually in a rush. Yes, we're in a rush anyway. Sorry about the dog in the background. Let's go to our highlights and lowlights of the week. Damon Linker.
Today is actually the first day of my semester teaching at the University of Pennsylvania in political science. I'm teaching a first-year seminar, a freshman seminar titled Conservatism in Theory and Practice. And my highlight is actually the book that I've chosen to use in this class, titled Conservatism, The Fight for a Tradition by Edmund Fawcett, who's a longtime economist author. The book came out, I guess, like 4 years ago from Princeton University Press. And I just want to recommend it to our listeners. If you're interested in political ideas, this book is a really, really good history. It focuses on the United States, Great Britain, and then mainly France and Germany, although in the more recent chapters, there's some other stuff about Orban and others around the world. But it's mainly a Western European and American story. But it's really fair-minded, very thoughtful, and he does a really great job of distinguishing between the kind of moderate Burkean tradition of conservatism and the more radical reactionary tradition of people like Joseph de Maistre and those who follow from him. And rather than be very polemical about the latter, he sees them as on a spectrum. And that, for my own thinking, has helped to clarify some things about the moment we're living through now with Trump and the kind of the misfits he's kind of drawn to him, one of whom maybe we could think of as the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance. He's, I think, more from that latter reactionary camp. But it's a long story. It's an old story, but it's a familiar story if you read a book like that. So I very much recommend it to our listeners.
Thank you for that. Fair-mindedness is something we like here at the Beg to Differ podcast. So that's great. Peter Wehner.
Yeah, this is, I guess, something of a low light. You know that it's an election year and Donald Trump is in trouble when he begins to invoke Jesus. Think about him, because he doesn't think about him in any other context. And a few days ago, he did an interview with Dr. Phil, and he said that if Jesus came down and was a vote counter, Trump would win California, which I thought was perfect. For some of us, Jesus is Savior and part of the Trinity, but for Donald Trump, Jesus is an unpaid campaign worker.
Perfect. Linda.
I have to get control of myself here. I'm giggling too much. So I have a highlight this week. It was a terrific piece on a very controversial topic, that of race, and it was in Persuasion. It was by Kiko Toro, Making Race Skin Deep. Racial attitudes in the United States need an overhaul. Latinos can show the way. And what Kiko does in this piece is to talk about the way in which race and color is treated so differently in Latin America. Of course, most Latin Americans are of mixed race because of the history of Latin America and because the Spanish were much more willing to intermarry, not just to father children with their slaves, but to free them and actually marry them, not to mention the indigenous population that was in Latin America. And so it's a very much more mixed population. But what he describes is something that I had never really thought about, except that I knew in my own life it was true, that when I was growing up, Mona, you would be a blonde. Because your hair was lighter than mine. I had black hair and it was blonde. And when people would ask what you are, in New Mexico, you were one of three things. You were Spanish, you were Anglo, or you were Indian, or Indio. And by the way, my black classmates were Anglos. That's the way they were thought of, because that was the way in which ethnicity was dealt with and culture was dealt with, and race was not really so much a thing. And there were so many different gradations in terms of color. And so anyway, I thought it was a really terrific piece. I think people should read it. It's in Persuasion. And if you want to understand how we might get better in this United States on race, maybe go the Latino way.
Thank you for that. I've come over the last several years to come to think that we should stop talking about races at all and just talk about ethnic groups, because I don't think races are very illuminating at all, and they're not even a real thing. So anyway, thank you for that. Bill Galston.
Well, just for the record, before I go on to two of my own highlights, I have read less benign interpretations of the role of color and light versus dark in Latin America. But I guess you have to take optimism where you can get it these days.
And as have I, Bill, as have I.
Right.
They are, in fact, obsessed with color, but it's not quite the same as here.
Right, but it's still meaningful and hierarchical, regrettably. I actually, maybe it's the effect of the Democratic Convention, but I'm going to abandon my usual tropism for lowlights and recommend a couple of articles. Let me just frame them very quickly. I think there's general sense, both on the issue of trade and our overall global obligations, that, the path that we pursued for roughly the quarter century from 1990 to 2015 has reached a dead end, but we're not quite sure where to go next. There's a lot of floundering. There are a couple of articles in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs that take a crack at those two problems. Walter Russell Mead, famous for his advocacy of a kind of Jacksonianism, is now, or at least a loving description of it, let me be absolutely fair to him, is now advocating what he's calling a Hamiltonian foreign policy, which is an interesting middle course between Jacksonian foreign policy on the one hand and Wilsonian foreign policy on the other. Worth a read. And then Princeton's redoubtable Aaron Friedberg, I think, makes a very strong case that if you're going to adopt a more restrictive stance on trade, you can't do it country by country. You need a coalition of people who are prepared to form a common policy front against particularly the People's Republic of China. He spells that out in some detail. Once again, food, I think, for productive thought.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to highlight a piece by Brett Stevens in the New York Times. The students are coming back to campus now, and this may reignite some of the protests about the war in Gaza that we saw in the spring. And so Brett offers a very bracing reminder that the moral outrage of these students and other protesters is very selective. And they focus it so much on this one conflict in the world when there are many others. And he cites Sudan, where the humanitarian group Operation Broken Silence estimates that at least 65,000 people have died of violence or starvation since the fighting broke out last year, and 11 million people have been turned into refugees. He cites Ethiopia, that has been engaged in ethnic cleansing of Tigrayans, one of the world's bloodiest recent wars, with a death toll estimated as high as 600,000. And he says, in case people want to say, oh, but those are not wars that American weapons are being used in, he mentions Turkey, which is not just an ally of the United States, but a NATO member, and that they have been occupying and ethnically cleansing Cyprus for 50 years, among other things. So anyway, he points this all out to say, to say that the world it contains many, many more opportunities for people to express their compassion for the victims of war, and yet the relentless focus on just one conflict. And he didn't say this, but I will. Just one conflict where the victim here was Israel. It was attacked in the most brutal fashion and is responding. A lot of these other countries are engaged in aggressive wars. And that makes a difference. Doesn't mean that Israel is justified in every single act that it takes against Hamas or against the people of Gaza, but it certainly is something that has to be weighed in the balance. With that, I want to thank our guest, Peter Wehner. Thank you so much, and our regular panel. Our producer, Jim Swift, and I want to thank Benjamin Parker, who is sitting in producing right now. Thank you for that. And to our viewers and listeners, of course, we love your attention and your comments. And thank you all. Beg to Differ will return next week, as every week.